everyone. This is Liz Bramlett coming to you from our training center. And what we're going to focus on in this session is what is a carryover allocation. For the purposes of the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, what does a developer need to understand about a carryover allocation? We start with the general rule that the IRS says that an owner needs to place their credits in service the same year they receive their credit allocation. This recognizes, however, that real estate development can be a very long process, whether it be new construction or acquisition rehab. And so it's often the case that the developer is unable to complete the development process, place their credits in service the same year that they receive their credit allocation. So in order to make this program more workable and really more realistic and more reflective of how the real estate development process really uses, they say that a developer can qualify for what's called a carryover allocation, but certain conditions they have to meet in order to meet and qualify for that carryover allocation. For example, they have to meet the requirements of what we're going to learn to be the 10% test. For purposes of qualifying for a carryover allocation, an owner has until the date, which is 1 year after the date of the credit allocation, to meet the requirements of the 10% test. So when you're going through this process, you want to make sure you have a strong tickler system, some sort of red flag that alerts you to the exact date by which you have to demonstrate your compliance with 10% test. And then certainly you place your credits in service no later than the end of the second year following the year the allocation was made. If you are approved for carryover allocation, you have 2 years to place into service. Property that fails to meet their 10% test does not have a valid carryover allocation. They have no credits. An owner that fails to place in service by the end of the second calendar year after allocation must return project's credits to the Housing Finance Agency, to the state. So it's critical that you know for sure by what date you have to meet your 10% test and by the end of what year you must place your credits into service. Mind that if you're running up against a deadline to get placed into service, let's say to comply with your carryover allocation, you need to be placed in service by the end of 2015. But you still have quite a bit of work to do, construction work to do, and not really ready to start the credit period. You haven't spent enough on rehab yet to meet the eligible basis goal you have to produce the credit you're counting on. Keep in mind that you can go ahead and place in service by the end of 2015 if by the end of 2015 you've at least spent enough to meet the minimum spending test for those rehab credits if you're doing an acquisition rehab project, which is when this often comes up. So if you need to place those rehab credits into service by December 30th, 2015, if you've spent the greater of 20% of the building's adjusted basis or at least $6,500 per unit, per low-income unit, then you can go ahead and place in service, and that can work for you because you can still start the credit period the following year, 2016, because you have the option of beginning the credit period the year following the placed in service date. And yes, you still need to add the basis, so you make basis and produce the credit you're counting on. You can add to eligible basis until the end of the first year of the credit period. So you place in service by the end of 2015 because you need to, based on the terms of your carryover allocation, finish construction in 2016 at the eligible basis to the end of 2016. You can still produce the tax credits you're projecting for your investor. A developer meets the requirements of the 10% test by incurring 10% of the expected basis by date that is 12 months following the date the HOA allocated the credits. And so again, you want to match make sure to track all of your relevant deadlines to ensure that you meet the required 10% test by the required date, and make sure, for any of your other funding programs that are supporting your development, what other deadlines you need to meet with regards to construction and getting into service and getting occupied. You want to make sure you're on target to meet those dates as well. Now, the expected basis is the basis that's expected as of the end of the second calendar year following allocation of the credits. In other words, what basis is expected to be by the time you place into service. And the building properties, you can satisfy the 10% test on your building or a project basis. Now, 10% test, what else goes into this? It's calculated on the adjusted basis of the land and depreciable property that's reasonably expected to be part of the property that's been allocated credits. So it includes, you want to notice this, direct and indirect costs for acquiring, constructing, and rehabilitating the property. So notice in there we said land. It is not included in eligible basis for calculating the credits, but factored into whether or not you're meeting your 10% test. Or may include in basis for meeting the 10% test the cost of the land, commercial space, and off-site improvements that are not included for calculating eligible basis when you actually calculate the tax credits. It may not include fees for permanent financing, reserves, cost to organize the partnership, marketing fees, or any syndication fees, and definitely compliance monitoring fees. If already paid some of those, they cannot be included for determining whether or not you've met your 10% test. Include fees for professional services. Here we're talking about architectural fees, engineering fees, etc. There must be a contract for them to actually provide the services. This must be performed by the deadline for meeting the 10% test, and that contract should allow for progress payments. So it's the payments you've made already by the time you meet that 10%. You need to meet that 10% test. Those payments that have been made up to that point can be factored in. These must be reasonable. The owner cannot pay these fees to themselves, and you want to make sure that you have the appropriate information to share with the Housing Finance Agency to show that the payments made, that they were reasonable fees, that they actually there's a contract to provide the services, etc. Include the full cost of the land in basis for meeting the 10% test. If land has been acquired by the tax credit owner, so the responsibilities of ownership have actually transferred to the owner. And you want to remember that that does not automatically occur just because you've put down a non-refundable down payment. Just because it's non-refundable doesn't mean you have the responsibility of operating that land like an owner would. You include the land if it's leased as an addition for sale, and the responsibilities of ownership have transferred to the owner. So the owner is responsible, is carrying insurance on it, does all the things that an entity does who's taken the responsibility for owning a piece of land. If we're located, the project we're talking about is located in a qualified census tract or difficult to develop area. The increase in basis that they might receive up to 30% increase in their eligible basis, that is not a factor in meeting the 10% test. And with any federal grants, they are subtracted from eligible basis. I want to make sure that you confer with your counsel as to how any grant you receive is factored or not factored into whether or not you've met your 10% test. The developer has to certify to the costs incurred to meet the 10% test, and how you have to do that. Is it electronic? Is it as manual? What backup they require? Whose signatures they require? That is established the Housing Finance Agency. You have to provide proper documentation. We know that it's going to have to be signed off by a CPA and perhaps by a tax attorney as well. You don't, of course, get to be 609 at that point because you've met 10% test, but you haven't placed in service. You still have a lot more construction work to do. So you'll still be waiting on receiving your 8609 forms until you place in service and provide that cost certification and that the carryover allocation certification as well, because they will not certify to your carryover allocation until you document that you've placed in service according to that 2-year deadline we've discussed. So know if I can be any help with you utilizing the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. You have my address here, my phone number, my email address. Follow me on Twitter, and you can also connect with me on LinkedIn. I look forward to talking with you again. Bye-bye.